Ahoy! It's your old buddy Hambone here, back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the promo code is IndieRPG, and it's good for $5 off orders of $25 or more, either online or in person. That's right, the code is IndieRPG, and it's running from September 14th through October the 5th. Never been a better time than now to pick up some fun new games, or maybe an old game that you had your eye on for a while, for yourself and for your friends and families. So why not go over to nobleknight.com, pop in the promo code IndieRPG, and get $5 off an order of $25 or more from September 14th to October the 5th. IndieRPG is the code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and today we are cutting to the chase. Jim Zub is back. He's here to talk about his brand new Kickstarter for Skullkickers, Caster Bastards and the Great Grotesque, as well as more Young Adventurers guides, more of his comic works, and a ton of other stuff that he's working on. I am never kidding when I refer to him as the hardest working man in storytelling today. So without further ado, friend of the show, Jim Zub. Hey Jim, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to have you again, and this time we are going to chat with you about your brand new RPG for Skullkickers.
Yeah, it's an exciting time right now. I got all kinds of good gaming stuff on the go, and this one's really special, honestly. So a lot of people may not know this because I'm kind of known now for doing the Dungeons and Dragons comics and writing like Conan the Barbarian at Marvel and stuff like that. But my first kind of fantasy project was an action comedy creator-owned comic series called Skullkickers, and we launched that ongoing series 10 years ago, like 10 years ago this month, September. And so I wanted to bring it back and do a kind of an anniversary thing. And as the summer was going on, it just kind of rolled and got bigger and bigger and crazier and crazier. And now we're doing this awesome Kickstarter project that is a new comic story, self-contained, and a 5e compatible tabletop RPG adventure.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, that is absolutely awesome. And how cool is that you get to bring it back right around for the 10th anniversary of this book?
Yeah, it's really fun and it's exciting. And it's like the nostalgia on that feels really pure, like there's something really sweet about being able to do that. And I've been, getting known for doing all sorts of tabletop stuff and doing the comic stuff. So being able to fuse both of those together is like, it's very peanut butter and chocolate. It is the way it should be. It is awesome. So yeah, it's been really, really amazing to have this thing come together. And we launched a Kickstarter campaign, and it's going really well. And just the response has been amazing. And also the chance to be able to bring people to check out this thing that I did, 10 years ago that they may not even have known about, that's like kind of a real pure love letter to tabletop gaming and kind of pulp fantasy and all the stuff that I love.
So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about the world of Skullkickers?
Sure. So Skullkickers, is like a love letter of D&D meets Conan. It's this very rough and tumble fantasy world and a lot of morally compromised, troublemaking characters. But at the heart of it is this trio of mercenaries who get themselves into all sorts of trouble. And when I made the comic, it was very much in the spirit of old school Dungeons and Dragons, the kind of, kick a door down, kick ass dungeon delve, gather the treasure and all that kind of stuff. And trying to channel the kind of excitement that I had playing D&D when I was like 10 years old and my older brother was my dungeon master and all this sort of stuff. And so the characters are very simple and ridiculous and get themselves into bigger and bigger crazy situations. And what they don't realize is all this evil, all this stuff is sort of happening around them. These huge demonic forces and these interdimensional kind of evil beings have these machinations, and these kind of idiots at the center of it, the more they do, the more they kind of wreck the plans of these greater powers. But they're always pretty much oblivious to the kind of grander sort of tapestry that they're involved in. But they're, it's almost like the butterfly effect. One stupid thing they do will cascade out of control or cause all these problems and eventually get them in the crosshairs of these massive evil villains. And it just keeps sort of spiraling out from there. And we got over the course of, we did like 34 single issues, which got collected into 6 volumes. And each one plays off of different kind of tropes from fantasy. So there's one where they're in like a noble court and they're trying to, get along with the hoity-toity nobles. There's another one where they're on a pirate ship. There's another one where they're on like a jungle on an island, the frozen north. Like we just sort of do this greatest hits collection of all the crazy stuff from fantasy, but with these guys kind of bulldozing their way through it and causing trouble at every turn. So it was very much like the pure distillation of my enthusiasm and the ability for players to confound a dungeon master. Like when you're reading Skullkickers, it kind of feels like they're supposed to be an epic fantasy, but instead the players are like punching through all of it and doing what they want instead. And that's very much by design. But so you don't actually have anyone rolling dice and there is no actual dungeon master, but you feel that frenetic kind of energy and the kind of snap decision making that ends up, at the heart of, I think, a lot of the spontaneity that makes role-playing games so much fun.
And the plans that are so crazy, they just might work.
Exactly, right? And so with this new one, the new one is called Caster Bastards and the Great Grotesque. We're riffing on kind of the school of magic sort of stuff. So we've never really delved that much into spell casting. The Skullkickers themselves are not magical in nature. They're just sort of ass kickers. Like they just go through and cause trouble and commit violence. Now they're infiltrating a school of magic where they're teaching spell casting and all this kind of stuff. So we get to riff on a lot of those kind of classic wizard tropes and play off of a lot of dorky fantasy magic stuff. Again, with these guys bulldozing their way through it or muddling their way along, which has been a ton of fun. And so as we've been building that story out, I realized, okay, it's called the Academy of Serious Sorcery and Holistic Occult Learning. And basically that school, we could sort of build it out into its own kind of setting. And so you get the story, which is a 30-page comic story, and then we're going to have at least 70 pages of role-playing game material. And if it keeps funding, then it keeps growing in terms of the RPG material that's involved. So we've got a complete tower map. We've got all these different plot lines and kind of encounter threads. We've got new spells and monsters and magic items, all kinds of really cool. There's even a social system for like how the students earn points to try and graduate. And so there's all these kind of machinations that are happening behind the scenes as these students are trying to earn enough points and qualify for graduation with their credits and all that kind of stuff. And so you can use that stuff in a campaign sort of regardless of whether or not you're running the adventure, or you can just hunker right down, make characters and go through the school year, or there's stats in there for all the Skullkickers. So you could have them show up, you could play them, you could have them as NPCs. There's just like all kinds of different options there for DMs to incorporate into the game.
And you got some killer art in there as well, right? Why don't you tell our listeners about who's doing the art?
Oh, absolutely. So Edwin Huang and Misty Coates are the original creative team for Skullkickers. They're back again doing the comic book story, and it's such a pleasure to work with them as always. Our letterer, Marshall Dillon, that's like our core team. I didn't want to do it unless we could get the band back together. And so I called them up and said, hey, I really want to do this cool thing. And they were all on board for it. And then in the RPG section, we've got Edwin and Misty doing some art, but we've also got some other people, really amazing people. Max Dunbar, who is known for doing the Dungeons and Dragons comic with me. He's designed up this amazing, the Academy Tower. He's doing a bunch of new artwork that's going to be in the back. I've got a bunch of other collaborators and industry friends who are going to be doing artwork that we haven't even revealed yet. And so over the course of the campaign and as it's going out there, we're going to be teasing more and more of that artwork. So the book looks beautiful. It's just going to be super high quality. And, as we break through stretch goals, it's like the quality of the book improves, the amount of content improves. And then we've got other fun extras, like you can get little NPC cards and treasure cards and stuff. So you've got those quick reference points on hand, all kinds of other cool. So we're going to have a battle map and all sorts of wicked stuff that's going to make this what I would want to see in an adventure if I was buying it, essentially. That's the thing about being like such a dyed-in-the-wool gamer is I don't want to make something unless it's something I would use or that I'm going to really enjoy. And the same kind of thing when I do the comics. Whenever we do one of these deluxe collections, I always put tons and tons of back matter in those things because that's the stuff I love when I'm looking through the books, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, speaking of being a fan of things, you talked earlier in the episode about how Skullkickers really is a love letter to Conan. For those listening at home, you are working on Conan right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what's so insane is that Skullkickers was the book that I did as this homage to like Conan the Barbarian, classic sword and sorcery, and Dungeons and Dragons. And, you know, thanks to that, I was put on a path where I got to work on all sorts of cool stuff and people saw me as a writer really for the first time. And now I literally write Conan the Barbarian for Marvel and the official Dungeons and Dragons comic. And I consult for Wizards of the Coast on a variety of D&D stuff. And so it's kind of all come full circle. And that's one of the things I think that's really exciting about doing this is saying, look at these 10 years, look how far we've come. Look at this cool, crazy ride we've been on. And now I get to write arguably one of the most influential characters in all of literature. You're talking about, you know, sword and sorcery as a genre was built off the back of Conan the Barbarian. And there are more Conan stories in comics than any other medium. It's kind of right neck and neck in terms of the fiction, indelibly in people's mind as a comic character, as a character of prose. And I'm now the monthly writer of Conan the Barbarian. It's insane. And so I get to build out the Hyborian Age and come up with really cool story stuff and try and make it as different as I can from just doing straight D&D because they are different from each other, you know, and try and pour myself into that kind of pulp mindset with everyone's favorite Cimmerian. So
you mentioned something earlier and it made me want to ask, do you think you would be a writer if not for role-playing games?
Oh, I've said this to the D&D crew time and time again. I'm a writer today. I'm a kind of a creator today because of Dungeons and Dragons. Like when I was, 8 years old and I started playing with my older brother and my cousins, I was the youngest person at the table. And D&D gave me a voice. It gave me the confidence to want to speak up and grab hold of the narrative and want to create things. This is what was so amazing about it for me is that you're sitting there at the table and, you're playing with older kids, let alone your brother. You've got to, 8 years old and 12 years old doesn't sound like a big gap, but it's actually like half your life, right? It's 4 years. And what 12-year-old wants to be hanging out with their 8-year-old younger brother. But at the game table, I get my turn on my initiative order. I get to tell you what I want to do. I get my spot. And speaking up and saying something that got the table excited or making my brother laugh was so powerful for me. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before, that I had his attention and I could make him see that I could be entertaining and fun and worth, hanging out with, if that kind of makes sense. The instant feedback, that entertainment, that ability to improvise and tell a story together, that was everything to me. That's what got me on the path of making that infinite number of characters that fills up a binder, or the kind of momentum that carried me forward so that when he went off to university, I started running games for my friends with that same kind of gusto and trying to bring that out of them as well. It just created a lifelong love of telling stories, creating characters, and being able to improvise. And that in and of itself is probably one of the most potent traits I've learned from role-playing games. And working in a creative field where you have a plan and then the plan has to get cast aside in the moment because the licensor wants something different or the project needs something different or our budget just got slashed or whatever. And you can't just throw in your chips and walk away. You've got to say, okay, how can we make this work? Or what can we do to improve this no matter what? And being fast on your feet and being full of ideas and being willing to collaborate with other people, not just kind of hold it too close to your chest and say my way or else, That's all from role-playing games. My creative career is one giant constant role-playing game session where I'm pretending to be a very capable writer and everyone keeps believing in the lie, like it's kind of wild.
And you're all tied in with Dungeons and Dragons and Conan, and you've sort of just made it entirely your life. But I always think it's interesting when I talk to folks who write, who've played, and how both things sort of inform each other.
Yeah, it's very formative. I've talked to so many different people, a lot of comic book writers, obviously, but TV and movie people and all kinds of stuff. And they say how potent it was, how much of an effect it had on them, because they realized the possibilities were endless. You know what I mean? The feedback was so potent as well. And that was such a crucial part of it for them.
All these nerds getting life lessons from the silly game they played, right?
I mean, that's kind of at the core of a lot of, I think, what makes these games stick with people. The tabletop role-playing games, a lot of people in their day-to-day lives don't feel like they have the ability to speak up or that they have control of a situation. And here in this kind of idealized, empowered thing, someone asks you what you want to do. And it's as simple as that, right? What do you want to do? And instead of having to even just look at a menu, you can go, man, sky's the limit. I just got to get creative or get into character. I think that's a really, really valuable thing. I wish more people had the opportunity to take advantage of that or realize how much fun that can be instead of just passively watching a movie or whatever.
Well, speaking of kids sitting around a table having fun, you're also stepping into the role of the writer on the Stranger Things Dungeons and Dragons comic book.
Yes. Yeah, that is a really amazing and unique project. So Jody Hauser has been the writer of the Stranger Things comics for a couple years now. And Dark Horse and IDW. So Dark Horse publishes the Stranger Things comics. IDW has the license to do Dungeons and Dragons. And they had been, I guess, talking for quite some time to try and make this work and finally figured out a way to do it. And then came to me and said, is this something you're interested in? And my initial response was not no, but just like, how's that going to work? Because what I didn't want to do is just try and do an in-character story because I felt like that would be very slight. You know, these are young kids. If we ran it purely on that, it's going to be, you know, pretty slam bam first edition dungeon delvey stuff, and we can make it fun, but I don't know that it would necessarily be resonant. And then I kind of came upon this idea of, okay, let's go deeper. Let's show these parallel stories in terms of how the kids discover D&D and the effect it has on them. All the stuff I just said about it giving me a voice and bringing something out of me, I want to show in the Hawkins, Indiana kids. Like, I want to show how Mike and Will and Lucas and Dustin, how finding D&D gives them strength and gives them a voice and a place that they didn't know they had. And that if we can do that while also showing fun kind of in-game stuff and really playing up the 80s nostalgia of first edition D&D, then I feel like then we've got something that can work, you know? And so Jody's been writing them in the comics for a while. And so and she's a big tabletop gamer as well. So we kind of came together to co-write this thing. And she handled a lot of making sure that the kids' voices sound right and the driving emotional stuff in the real world. And then I was like, I grew up in this era. That is exactly when I was playing D&D. Here's some really great signifiers and potent things we can pour into that. And here's how we can build out the in-game story. And we really work together incredibly well. Diego Galindo, who's the artist on it, is doing just a stunning job on these pages. It's always tough when you've got to do likenesses of real people. And it can tend to look stiff or it can look overly photo referenced, but he's done a phenomenal job at finding the style and making sure that it all just feels like a great comic instead of it being overly posed or stiff looking.
So that's awesome. In a lot of ways, it sounds like it might be a prequel to the first season, or does it actually lead in or tie into the television series at all?
So it does both. So over the course of 4 issues, we go through kind of the first 3 seasons. So the first issue takes place before season 1, and it actually shows the kids playing D&D for the very first time, how they get the basic set, and how they meet Dustin, because he's not actually in the group when they start. So the very first time that Lucas and Will and Mike talk to Dustin, I got to write that scene, which is kind of surreal.
That's awesome.
They're actually at school playing in the cafeteria, playing D&D, and Dustin notices the dice and starts talking about probabilities for the math. And that's how they end up kind of all talking together in that moment. Then the second issue takes place right at the end of season 1. So Will has been to the Upside Down and gone through all that traumatic stuff. And it's how does he get out of the hospital and try and get back to some sort of normal life? And how does that reflect in the game? You know what I mean? Then the third issue takes place, I think, at the end of season 2. And so then you've got 11 and Max are around. and they don't know anything about D&D, so the boys are going to try and teach them how to play in the third one, which is a ton of fun. And all of them have their character classes, and Max wants to play a Zoomer, which is what she talked about in the show. And we're like, Zoomer's not really a thing, but then we find a way to make it work within the rules, and it's really kind of fun. And then the fourth issue is particularly poignant because it's the last session that they play at the end of season 3 before Will's going to move away. So it's sort of wrapping up the big campaign and making those final kind of, decisions about their characters and how far they've come. And so over the course of 4 issues, we go through 3 seasons of the show, and we touch upon these milestones of their lives that are all predicated around Dungeons and Dragons.
How long a leash do you have when working on something like that? Are you pretty free, or do you have to run stuff by?
I mean, you've got 2 publishers and 2 licensors, right?
Yeah,
so
that seems like a nightmare.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And, Wizards of the Coast isn't just Wizards of the Coast. You're talking about Hasbro. And the Stranger Things D&D box set that they did for the game, I think it was last year or the year before, did phenomenally well. And so everyone wanted this to happen, but it also meant the pressure is that much higher, you know what I mean? And there's more eyeballs on it. The good news is I did a really tight outline for what the story was going to be up front. So we made it very clear, here's what we're going to cover emotionally, here's what we're going to show, here's the first edition D&D stuff we're going to touch upon, and here's why. And so we cleared the air very early. It was very well structured, and that saved a lot of hassle. Same kind of thing when I was doing Rick and Morty versus D&D, right? You got Adult Swim and you got Hasbro and you got all the pieces there, and you're trying to get past the goalposts with these big licenses, and part of it is about getting on the phone and enthusiastically explaining to them why this is going to work. You know what I mean? That is part of the pitch, right? It's not just a cold robotic process. You have to get people on board creatively. You have to convince them this is the right path to take, and any other path is crazy, right? I did the same kind of thing with the Young Adventurers guides, where I was like, here's why this is going to work. And you kind of got to go in confident, because you have to generate that confidence in everyone else on the team. You know what I mean? If you don't believe in it, then why should they believe in it, right? Once we struck upon this idea of the 2 parallel sides of it, the real world and the in-game stuff, then it was just a matter of figuring out what those points in time were. And I knew one of them had to be how they start playing D&D. That was sort of the easiest one to work with. And then it was just sort of putting those milestones down in the sand and saying, okay, why is this the right one to do? What emotionally are we going to show? And how can we fit between the show without just repeating what's in there, right? Because they actually, if you watch Stranger Things, D&D always gets referenced, but they don't show them playing very often. They show them playing maybe 3 times in 3 seasons.
Yeah.
Because it's about, the lexicon from the game gets worked into the dialogue, or the way they explain the supernatural stuff to each other. That becomes part and parcel of kind of how they codify the weird stuff that's happening to them, not necessarily, hey, we're going to roll dice for everything. And so now I was sort of looking and saying, no, now we're going to roll dice for everything. One of the toughest things for me was the research phase on it. Because the show is set on very specific dates, I had to figure out what products TSR had released and had not released that we could reference, right? Little stupid things like, what was the suggested retail price for the original basic set? I got to track that down. And, dumb stuff like that I just want to get accurate.
Having tried to track some of that stuff down on my own for the feed, I sympathize. That's really hard research.
The good thing is that I've got the D&D mothership that makes it a lot easier. So I could just send them, here's my list of questions. You got to give me all this info because it's important. I need these graphics. I need this stuff, The other thing was little stuff like, Diego is an amazing artist, but I'm sending him reams and reams of reference material, because first edition orcs don't look like second, third, fourth, or fifth edition orcs. You know what I mean? And they're fighting orcs in this story, so they got to look like something out of the original monster manual. It's just little things like that I really wanted to get right. The original D&D basic set has this set of dice that is a very specific color. So we want to, match the colors from the original dice. And the original D20 didn't have numbers from 1 to 20. It had 1 to 10 twice.
Why?
Because they were not made for Dungeons and Dragons. They were bought from a math company.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those before.
Yeah. They were bought to show randomizing to school kids in school. So the D20 was from 1 to 10. And then there was in the box, there was like a marker that you would use to mark half the sides as the high or the low side of that 20. And so I have the kids do that in the comic because that's accurate to the first edition of D&D. And so that was the kind of stuff that I was sending. And my comic book editor is like, this is crazy. And I'm like, we got to get it right. We got to do it. Maybe there's only a handful of first edition, readers that will care, but I care. I want to be accurate. There's a reference at one point that I made in the script to a movie that the kids had gone to see. I had to go, oh my God, did that movie come out at that point of the year? So I had to go double check if the movie had been out yet. And luckily we were good. Just stuff like that. Diego drew a movie poster in the background of one of the bedrooms of the kids. And I was like, I don't think that movie's out yet. Got to double check the date. We got to try and be accurate. So it's just like little stuff like that, going that extra mile to make it feel grounded in that period and playing D&D in that period, and my own memories and nostalgia kind of filtering through the kids, but still in a way that is them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love the level of nonfiction research you're doing to get it right for a 4-issue comic series.
Because I've got so much nostalgia for the period and for the game, it means something to me to get it right. Like, it's not just about a technical accuracy. There's something very potent about being able to go through my original monster manual and scan that stuff for Diego and go, look, this is what it should look like. Or, hey, let's do an homage to this iconic piece of art from the player's handbook. And me and 20 other people will pick up on that, but I'm going to be so happy that it's in there. We did that a lot in Rick and Morty versus D&D. We referenced just some deep, dark, old grognard stuff that I loved because it made me happy to put it in there. And only like 3 people have brought some of those up to me when I meet them at a convention. But man, they are so giddy because we did that thing, because we really, really dug down. And you can see the love in the process and you can see it in the final result, right?
Absolutely. And, one of the things I think I appreciate most about you is your passion for all of the things that you create. And, before we wrap up, I would be remiss if I didn't talk to you a little bit about the thing that brought you to our table, which is the Young Adventurer's Guide.
Yeah.
Because that level of love that you put into it. I mean, I'm looking at the preview right now for the next one from your website, and I'm going to just tell you, it's not really a spoiler, because if you go to jimzub.com right now and you look up the preview for the next Young Adventurer's Guide, Beasts and Behemoths, page 22, Lord freaking Soth.
Yes, right? Like, that book has been such a fun one to put together. It feels almost like a victory lap because Monsters and Creatures was like the proving ground for this series is going to work. And it was the most popular book. It's been the most popular one so far in the series. Kids love monsters. Kids love codifying and identifying and understanding how these creatures work. And it's so easy to be able to put them in those profiles and understand them. And so we wanted Beasts and Behemoths to be in the same vein, but different. And so instead of going through locations, like in the original one, we start underground, we work to the surface, and then we go up into the sky. This one, we're going by size categories. So we start with tiny and small creatures, then we go medium, then large, huge, and then gargantuan. So a kid can, go through this book and feel the epicness growing as you go through, because more and more cool stuff is getting bigger and bigger as you go. And just like last time, we also sprinkle in these legendary, creatures and villains. And one of those, we were doing Death Knights, and I was like, we got to do Lord Soth, man. Like, that's iconic to me. Dragonlance is phenomenal, and he's such a cool visual character and so interesting. I think that kids now will respond to it just as well as I did when Dragonlance came out. There's a reason why, characters like Strahd or Drizzt or Soth or any of these characters are still part of D&D. It's because they're cool, they're iconic. I want to have, in one of the future books, I would love to have like a Warduke show up or something.
Yes, please.
Right? Because that's cool. And it's, such a cool character and such a neat thing. And again, if a parent is flipping through and they go, oh my God, I remember that. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. If a kid responds to it and thinks it's cool, it doesn't matter if it's old or new. It's just part and parcel of D&D. So yeah, there's so much cool stuff in the new Beasts and Behemoths. A few standout ones for me. We've got lycanthropes in there. So we got your werebear and your wereboar and your were-rat, along with the classic kind of werewolf and stuff. We have the other half of the dragon equation. So we have all the metallic dragons work their way into there. And then, as people see on the cover, we've also got the mighty Tarrasque, which is just like, such a classic insano creature that a kid is just their eyes are gonna pop when they realize how huge that thing is, you know. That's the kind of stuff that I love doing. It's so funny when we were getting sketches for the cover, the artist did a great job, did all these sketches of the Tarrasque like tearing stuff apart. The editor for the book over at 10 Speed, which is the imprint of Random House we're working with Wizards, she was like, oh, this creature doesn't look like a dragon. I'm like, well, he's not a dragon. He's like this giant, you know, mythical monster. And she goes, it looks more like a dinosaur. I'm like, is that a bad thing? I think kids like dinosaurs almost as much as they like dragons. I think we're good, you know? And so it's great having our editor. She is wonderful. And what's great is she brings a real fresh eye to the stuff. Like I'm trying to make these books for brand new players and new readers. And so sometimes it can be really easy to get caught up in the language that I know and the stuff that I know. And so we're writing things and she's asking very relevant questions like, does this make sense? And I'm like, oh, we got to stretch this out a little more. We got to explain what this is a little bit more because I've got, you know, 30 plus years of gaming caught in my brain that, you know, sets up all the material for me.
I have to say that every time Lord Soth shows up somewhere and he still has the coffee canister helmet, I just feel like this inexplicable sense of relief, like that no one has decided to change that.
Yeah, don't redesign that. Sometimes the classics are the best, right?
And as soon as you take a look at it and think about it, you're like, why? That doesn't make any sense. Like, that would be really uncomfortable, but it looks awesome.
The glowing eyes in that dark space in the gap of the helmet, that's all you need. That's what makes it look so friggin' cool.
The big horsetail on the top. It's so good.
Oh, man, it's so good. Those designs are so great. I had I still have it, the Art of Dragonlance book. And the spine is falling apart on it because I flip through it and flip through and flip through it. And I love seeing the rough sketches and the design passes and the concept art before they finalize those designs. And that, to me, was a really formative book because it showed me process in a way I hadn't seen before, that someone did multiple passes before they got the final. And it was almost like, oh, you can make mistakes or, oh, you can iterate this stuff. It's not just finished material. You know what I mean?
There's a sketch in one of the books of the earlier design where he's like has the open helmet with the skull face, and it's just like meh, you know, like it doesn't work. And when the Parkinson and Caldwell paintings show up, you're just like, yes, these are so good.
And you know it. You can imagine someone sending that one in and everyone going, that's it. That's the one. And that's a really cool thing for people to see. I think it's one of the reasons why people like those behind the scenes kind of process things, because it humanizes the art form. It says people's hands were on this and they went through a process. It's not just sparkles and everything is done. You know, it's hard work and it's sometimes going in the wrong direction for a bit until you figure out what you want to do and then bringing it back around. And it's one of the reasons why I like people knowing about the process, because I don't know, I think some creatives, they like having it be very obtuse. Like they just want you to think, well, I'm brilliant. I came up with an idea. And it's like, it's okay to show that people work hard. It's okay to show that people make mistakes. Do you know what I mean? That if you keep at it, you will improve and you will strengthen your ability, you know? The biggest difference for me now, and I try and explain this to people, they'll say, do you have writer's block? Because you're doing so many different projects. You must just write all the time. And it's like, you know, I have slow spots. I have difficulties. I have times when I don't feel like I can do this or imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff. And they say, but well, then, you know, how do you get over it? And I go, well, in some ways you don't. You still always have those fears and you still always have those problems. The difference is now I've gone through those lows and come out the other side so many times that instead of being like, oh, I suck and this is impossible, I now go, oh, this is the part of the process where I think I suck and this is impossible. Do you know what I mean? Like I still feel it and I still worry, but I've been through it and come out. So I'm like, oh, why can't I get over this? Why does this always have to happen? You know what I mean?
Why is it always a Tuesday?
Why is it always a Tuesday or whatever? Yeah. And you come out the other side and you're like, oh, thank God we did it. You know, got it done. And then you head into the next one. You go, maybe this one, we won't have that fear. And then you strap in for another ride and you're like, oh God, here we go. You know, that's just part of the creative process, I guess. And so normalizing that, trying to teach people, look, this is totally normal. You don't feel like you can do it, or you're afraid, or you make mistakes, or your rough drafts look like crap or whatever, but you have to keep going. That's the difference. You have to be persistent and you have to keep at it and you have to not give up. And then you can finish things and then you can learn from them. That's kind of something really valuable about the creative process, you know?
When I was a kid, I had the Return of the Jedi sketchbook. It was all like, the concept drawings for all the aliens and such that showed up in that movie. And I just remember like, A, not quite understanding what I was looking at because it was really young. I was like 5. But B, like I got like such a huge sense of the scope of the universe. I thought that these were just extra pictures of things that existed in that universe, which is what happened down the line. They went back to those old designs and, well, we'll use that for a role-playing game. We'll use that for a video game, whatever.
It's so funny you mentioned that because I did a short story there's a book coming out in November called Empire Strikes Back from Another Point of View. And they did one a few years back for Star Wars from Another Point of View. And it's a series of short stories that are canon, literally showing what other characters, minor characters, were doing during the movie that are not, Luke or Leia or Han Solo or whatever. So the bartender at the cantina, what is his perception of Obi-Wan and Luke and everyone coming into the bar and the fight breaking out and all that kind of stuff? And he just wants to get through his day and sling some drinks or whatever. And it's amazing how many of those stories, how entertaining they are and how ridiculous, some of the little details. And everything in the Star Wars universe is built out so much now. I did one for the Empire Strikes Back one. I can't tell you what character I did because it hasn't been announced yet. But I got to write a short story for this book. And this book is jam-packed with like nerd celebrities and these amazing authors. And I'm like,
nerd celebrities.
how did I get into this thing? Like, I'm the comic book guy. How did I get snuck in under the rope or whatever? And so I'm working away and I was like, oh, it'd be really fun is if I name this other character that's in the background or this creature thing. I'm an idiot. Of course, everything's named. Of course, if it shows up for one frame in the movie, there's already a Wikipedia article about it that's already been written and a design somewhere in the Lucas archives or whatever. So I'm like, yeah, this thing right there. And they're like, oh, that's called a blah. And then they send me all the profile and information on it. And I was like, holy crap. Like you guys have built everything. This is insane. Well, good. I'll reference that thing that you guys already have hordes of information on, or whatever. It's so weird.
And the crazy thing about we're totally digressing, but the crazy thing about that is Bill Slavicsek recently wrote a book about his time working on the West End Games Star Wars game, and he did most of that.
Yeah, that's the thing. They didn't have all that stuff back then. Same thing with the Marvel comics. They were just shooting from the hip the whole time, and then a bunch of that stuff became canon, which is hilarious, right? I'm actually playing one of the games I'm playing right now, a tabletop, is Edge of the Empire. So a friend of mine, Jackson Lansing, is running a game for us online. We play, once a week. And he sent us a spreadsheet of all the races we could choose for the game. And I looked at this dizzying spread. It's like 90 different alien races or whatever. And I was like, I don't have time to look up all this stuff. I'll be the human guy. So I'm the one human in the party running around, us scoundrels, doing all this stuff, whatever. I'm the Jack Burton of this adventure or whatever you want to call it, right? So it's kind of awesome in that way and ridiculous and amazing, It's such a good time. I've actually really been enjoying playing tabletop games online this summer. I've sort of gotten together with friends more than I would normally, just because we've been able to schedule it out and make it part of our calendar and whatnot. So I'm thankful on that front anyway.
Yeah, I feel like I've played more tabletop role-playing games in the last 6 months than I have in the last 6 years, like just more consistently, and it's just been...
I think people need the escapism, and then also it's a good excuse to get together and socialize. We usually talk for about half an hour, just how you've been, what's new in your life, and then at some point, we've been doing rotating dungeon masters as well. So I ran Feng Shui, which is this like Hong Kong action movie role-playing game, which is awesome. We did like one adventure, maybe about 4 sessions. Our other friend Zach ran Call of Cthulhu, and now Jackson's running Edge of Empire. And we're already kind of thinking about what we might do next. It's like we're doing this tour of role-playing games for a bunch of people who haven't played that many different games.
Nice.
And so we all get to kind of show off some of our favorite systems and surprise people, which has been great.
And this is a moment in time, like you said earlier, role-playing games are great for sort of like letting you have control. And we're in a situation where we have so little control.
We don't have any.
Yeah.
And, it's giving us a good reason to socialize, but not just dwell on the difficulties of the day-to-day, but to empower ourselves and say, what do you want to do? And let's have fun together and build some memories that aren't just our current fears and what may have you. And I think that's one of the reasons why D&D is doing so incredibly well in the face of all this stuff. 5th edition is bigger than ever. And then this year, yes, people are pivoting to online, but as a game, it's huge. They're doing so much right. And they're really, they've been so smart about releasing a bunch of free material and pointing people in the right direction and providing ways for people to get into the hobby. And then people are also moving from D&D to other games, which I think is really valuable, that they realize, oh man, D&D's fun and I'm having a great time. What's this over here? What's that over there? Man, I want to try Shadowrun or Vampire the Masquerade or just whatever. And I think all the games are benefiting from the rising tide kind of thing.
Speaking of games that people will love to kill some time with, let's tell our listeners when your Kickstarter is wrapping up, because there's still time to get in on the Skullkickers Kickstarter.
Yes, actually. So Skullkickers, Caster Bastards, and the Great Grotesque runs until October 2nd. And we are incredibly excited to be bringing this out. The response has been amazing. Even if you've never read the comic before, you can easily dive in. It's a completely self-contained, new reader-friendly story. It's big and it's chaotic and it's ridiculous. If you've enjoyed any of the other stuff I've done on Dungeons & Dragons or The Avengers or Conan the Barbarian or any of the many titles I've worked on, please dive in. This is like kind of the pure, unfiltered Zub comic crazy that really got me going on my comic writing career. And it means so much to me to be back with the team doing it. It's going to be packed with a campaign-worthy adventure that will give you all sorts of new fun rules and items and creatures to put into your own campaigns. And we're going to be doing a big celebration, I'm sure, on the 2nd to wrap it all up. Beasts and Behemoths comes out October 20th. And so that'll be the 5th of the Young Adventurers Guides. We've got a 6th one that's in development. No title's been announced yet, but I cannot wait for people to see what we've got cooking on that. And Stranger Things D&D issue 1 is in stores November 2nd. And it is a really, really special comic. If you've loved the show, obviously, if you love D&D, particularly old school D&D, I think you're going to find a lot there to love and a lot of really pure kind of nostalgia for the Arneson Gygaxian era.
I love it. Folks, don't be shy about checking out any of Jim's works. I can promise you will not be let down. Jim, thank you so much again for coming on the show.
It is my absolute pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. And thanks for, holding the torch high on classic gaming. It is great stuff.
Thanks again to Jim Zub for coming out and having a wee chat with Stu and I. Folks, there is still time to get in on the Skullkickers, Caster Bastards, and the Great Grotesque Kickstarter. You've got a few days left. I can't recommend this enough. If you're a fan of Zub's work, or if you want to check out some of Zub's work, go to your local comic shop. They will have something that he worked on. He's worked on so many comics, and they're all great. If you really like Zub, and you're like, man, I don't know if comics are for me, but I love his work on Dungeons & Dragons, he's got a Dungeons & Dragons comic, and go to any bookstore and ask for the Young Adventurers Guides. You will not be disappointed. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you like the show, think about joining our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. You get early release episodes, you get behind-the-scenes videos, you get a behind-the-scenes look at the book that Stu's working on, as well as a behind-the-scenes look at the game that I'm working on. We've got a private Discord channel as well, just for our patrons to have conversations. We love hearing from you all, so please think about checking out patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.